Welcome everyone, and thank you all for being here today. So we're going to try to give you a bit of an overview of education underfunding trends in British Columbia and some of the impacts that flow from those trends. As Glenn described, we have a 15-year plus legacy of education underfunding in British Columbia, and our job here today is to try to sort of present those in a way that you can understand some of the key trends and the impacts. And we're going to do so by, in some part, we're going to be looking at some of the myths and realities of education underfunding. In the throne speech that just was presented this week, the British Columbia government once again heralded education funding being at record levels at $5.1 billion. And once again, that is a convenient messaging because it actually sort of obscures the truth, which is that education funding, yes, in terms of total overall dollars, it is at record levels, but when you factor in inflation and other cost pressures, et cetera, we actually see a different picture. So what we're going to look at here particularly is education spending as both a percentage of British Columbia's gross domestic product, or GDP, and as a percentage of total government spending over the last 15 years. So if you take a look at this chart here that's up, in the chart that's the pencil at the top, shows you the change in education spending as a percentage of total public spending. So education used to comprise about 1/5 of overall public spending in 2000-2001. By 2016-17, in our budget estimates, we're down to 11.8%. That is hardly record levels, right? And again, Alex did this really well in his piece that he, and I think most of you probably have seen Alex's piece on education funding and the picture in his piece with the CCPA, but he took a look particularly at education funding as a percentage of gross domestic product, or what we use as a measure of the health of any economy. And that has gone down from 3.4% to 2.2%. Once again, hardly record levels. We see steady declines in both respects.
So, as Sherri and Terry mentioned, I'm with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, Canada's leading progressive research institute, independent nonprofit public policy institute. And if you want to follow our work, if you don't already, you can follow me on Twitter. That's an option, but there are many other ways as well. Our policynote.ca blog focuses in particular on policy developments here in BC. And if you haven't seen it, I did publish an analysis last year in August called "What's the Real Story Behind the Education Funding Crisis in BC?" and it touches on the themes that Sherri's just started introducing, which is that on the one hand, you know, we have heard this talking point again and again that funding is at record levels in the province, but that, I think, and for the public, that's, you know, often it's been hard to follow the debate because of that rhetoric of record funding and how sharply it's clashed with the reality on the ground that, you know, the folks in this room know more better than just about anybody, the reality that parents and teachers have observed on the ground of you know, overcrowded classrooms and being asked to fundraise for very basic provisions like playgrounds. And of course, you know, we saw last spring budget crises in over half of the school districts around the province. And the provincial government response was to point the finger at those school boards and say, you know, this is your problem. And in the Premier's mandate letter to the Minister of Education, she instructs him as her first priority to control spending in education, as if the education budget was ballooning out of control. But we know that's not the case, and for exactly the reasons Sherri was just explaining, you know, you can look at it, you can cut these numbers in a lot of different ways. You know, you look at them, education funding as a share of the provincial budget, it's in decline. Looking at it as a share of GDP, as a share of our total economic pie, I think is a really interesting and useful measure because it's really a fundamental measure of affordability. So if we want to prioritize public education in this province, as I think just about every British Columbian does, some of them are given pause when they're told, well, we might like to invest, education's a good thing, but we can't afford it. Well, when you look at spending as a share of our total economic pie, that is by definition, if you, for example, maintain a constant share of education funding as a share of the total economic pie as a share of GDP, that is by definition sustainable funding. It's tied to the economic growth. So it really puts lie to the idea that we might like to fund more, but we can't afford it when you take a look at that decline in funding as a share of GDP. So you can measure, even that you can measure in different ways, but generally you come to see about a 1% decline in funding as a share of GDP. And what that means in concrete terms, in dollar terms, is over $2 billion a year. So, I mean, I think that's a figure that most folks in the province haven't heard. I'm sure many of you have. But it's striking, and it really tells us what's possible in terms of our capacity to reinvest in the system. Now, the other point I think to make is, it's often pointed out that there has been this decline in enrollment. The government likes to point to that and say, well, that explains all the decline in funding. Well, of course, we know that's not so. And when we look here at funding on a per student basis, which controls for that enrollment issue, we know that BC is the second lowest funded education system in the province, $1,000 below the national average. Numbers I think folks in this room will have heard before, but it bears repeating because there are all these different methods of subterfuge and argument that the government has tried to use over the past year to get around the reality of underfunding. The other point on the funding issue that I wanted to touch on is that, so in addition to the class overcrowding and the wonderful victory that you all have won at the Supreme Court of Canada, there are these range of other cost pressures that have been downloaded onto local school districts that have put the system under a different type of squeeze. So we've seen over the past 15 years, for example, MSP premiums more than doubled by the provincial government, BC Hydro rates increasing, WorkSafe BC rates increasing, the carbon tax coming online, which is a good thing in and of itself in that case. But the issue is when you start downloading these costs onto school districts, of course, if you don't send compensating dollars of funding along with that, you're going to leave the system under enormous pressure. And, even the government in its own internal documents released under access to information acknowledged that these cost pressures, over and above just the inflation rate, amounted to about $200 million a year. From an estimate a few years ago, it would be higher now. Coming back to this myth of the enrollment declines, again, as I mentioned before, you can see the underfunding when you look on a per-student basis in addition to as a share of the economy. The other point that's important to make is that we've seen declining enrollment in just about every province in the country over the last period of time. Now, what's different between BC and all the other provinces, you can see here. The only province to have a decline in FTE educators over that same period. So, I think we understand that declining enrollment does not have to mean fewer teachers. And I'm from the north myself. I remember graduating high school in 2002 in Prince George, and watching the extraordinary wave of school closures at the time. And we were told at the time that this is a necessity, but of course it wasn't. It never was, and it wasn't during the funding crisis that we've seen over this past year. And I'll say it's actually one really encouraging contrast between the crisis over the past year and the crisis in 2002 is that at the time in 2002 we asked our myself and some other student activists and parents who were very concerned about what was about to happen to our education system asked our local trustees in Prince George to reject the cuts budget and say no to the provincial government. And of course, they noted to us correctly that if they did that, they would be fired. Correctly, but not exactly valorously. So it was really encouraging for me anyway to see that case put to the trustees here in Vancouver over this past year, and for them to step up to that challenge. So I see a couple of them are in the room today, and I just want to congratulate them on that stand. So the message I want to leave you with before I turn it over to Sherri, in terms of this overall funding issue, this big picture from the perspective of the public finances of BC, which is the focus of my work in relation to public services, is that there really is no question that we can afford to reinvest in the system in the province. We know that when we look at those share of GDP numbers. Yeah, I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
So getting to the impacts of underfunding, we'll be hearing a lot about those. For those of you in this room, you already experience those on a day-to-day basis. We'll be hearing about those as well at the breakout sessions this morning and this afternoon. But just to go over a few, we know all of these types of things: declining numbers of teachers, specialist teachers, increasing class sizes and complexities, all the way down to the pressures of privatization. We're going to cover a few of those today. I think we're pressed a little for time here. So the reality is, as Glenn described, that we have lost over 3,500 positions, including over 1,600 specialist teachers. And the reality, once again, that Alex was speaking about is that enrollment declines don't match that reality, right? So we're seeing here, for example, English language learners. We've lost 33%, over 33% of our English language learner teachers, but we're seeing a headcount enrollment increasing. Same with Aboriginal education, with special education and teacher librarians. Enrollment figures don't match the declines in teaching positions. So again, that myth that, well, we have fewer students to serve, it just doesn't bear out with the figures. It doesn't bear out with the stats. And so that's something to think about when you think about the on-the-ground realities that you as parents and you as teachers live every day with respect to how do we meet the needs of children who have exceptional learning needs. And those challenges are acute, and they are significant, and they have been increasing year by year by year. So the loss, as we know, of specialist teachers has meant reductions or eliminations of important public education services. When you look at, for example, FTE students per librarian, some districts, for example, Coquitlam, have eliminated librarians altogether. And some districts we're seeing the declines of teacher librarians. They come in for a half day, twice a week, 3 times a week, et cetera. Children, we have a province that supposedly cares so much about literacy, but yet we are seeing that we have 1 teacher librarian for every 961 students on average around the province. And in some districts, even that ratio is much, much higher. So again, the reality is that classes in BC schools are also increasing in size and complexity. Once again, when we think about inclusion, we think about meaningful inclusion. We want to see our students that are provided with proper supports and services in their classrooms. And those supports and services have been declining over the last 15, 16 years. We now have 50% growth rate in the number of classes in British Columbia that have 4 or more students with individualized education plans with special needs. And the issue around class composition is the idea that we need to drive those resources to students. And when we have 4 or more students in a classroom with special needs and we have not enough or insufficient or no services for those children, that becomes a very difficult learning environment, working environment, et cetera. As Terry mentioned, I have a child with very severe special needs, and I have had to, and I'll talk about this in my breakout session if you come, I have had to advocate very strongly in a very difficult climate to get him even a fraction of the services he desperately requires. And any of parents in the room or teachers in the room who teach children with special needs knows this, that it is a battle. It is a battle on all fronts that you have to wage as parents and teachers and parent advisory committees. And the capital issues, we see these in the news recurring all the time. They should be bigger news than they are. This is what we are exposing our teachers and our kids to: lead, radon, asbestos, seismic issues. We have a breakout session as well this afternoon that will talk about these issues, particularly And we will be looking at that. And again, the Supreme Court, when we're going to need to address, as Glenn mentioned, some of the facilities issues. How do we deal with the lack of facilities as well as declining and facilities that are just simply inadequate to our needs of our children and our teachers who work in these and learn in these conditions? And of course, the real irony, of course, is that while we have been doing this, or while the government has been doing this for the last 15 years, there has been a steady privatization creep in the public education system. This is the chart here that I really want to draw your attention to, which is that if you take a look on the right there, the growth in public or independent school funding has gone up by 92% since 2000. Over the last 16 years, they have witnessed a 92% increase in funding. Whereas the public system has only received a 19% increase in funding. Yes, that is shame, absolutely. So this is something that we need to be thinking about when we're looking at what is the government doing with its dollars. When they make an announcement, I'm thinking it was about a month and a half ago, this all blends into each other now, unfortunately, these announcements, around the $1 million for special education schools. What does that tell parents like me about where my child should be, right? What does that tell us about the value of special education, the value of children with special needs? What does that tell us about how we treat our teachers who are trying to provide inclusive education in our public schools? We know what that tells us, and it's very disturbing. And of course, British Columbians don't feel this way. Overwhelmingly, British Columbians oppose government subsidy to private schools. Over 3/4 of British Columbians report that they oppose private school subsidies, but yet the government continues on with this hybrid public policy ideological march. I'm going to let Alex wrap this up.
So just taking one last step back to the very big picture in BC, the context that all of this has been happening in. Talked about the decline in education funding as a share of GDP, but this has been part and parcel of an overall assault on the public sphere and the public sector in this province. And that's what this graph is meant to illustrate. This is looking at overall provincial public spending as a share of the economy since 2000. It has declined dramatically, and it's not an accident. It's a result of very specific public policy choices, including tax cuts that have overwhelmingly benefited the richest British Columbians and corporations. To give you just one taste of that, the households in the top 1% in BC now pay $39,000 a year less in tax than they would have under the tax system from 2000. And if you're interested more in that issue, we've just published an analysis of that system, which you can find on the Policy Note blog that was published this week and on the TAI. And I just think it's always important to remember that overall context as we fight these fights in education and in all these different spheres. Thanks.
Thanks a lot to Sherri and Alex. Nothing makes us crazier as teachers, for sure, when we hear highest funding ever exclaimed from the Minister of Education. And so hopefully, you know, you've been given some tools to really unpack that claim. And you can, as I think Glenn said yesterday, you can increase education budgets by $1 every single year and claim it's highest funding ever. But we can see how far we've fallen behind and how far we've fallen behind other provinces as well. We do have time for a few questions, if there are any in the audience. Cindy. Do you want to take that or do you want me to? Do you want me to? So the uncategorizing of students has been a concern of ours for a long time, and because we've heard rumors, we know that government has conducted meetings across the province about the categories and that sort of thing. But at the moment, we've asked them directly, are you planning to decategorize students? And there are some students that don't that have sort of in essence been decategorized because they don't fit in the categories as they've changed over time. They've assured us that they don't plan to do that. At the table that we're at right now in terms of the restoration of our language, the categories are mentioned in some collective agreements, and they will remain in those collective agreements, and the conversation has been around, just restoring the composition language, including the categories. And so we know that there are some changes happening, and that is to align with the DSM-5. And so those changes are happening. It is a concern, always, of ours. It is a way to save money, and that would be significant money to save. And so it is something that we need to be really vigilant about, because what that does is it directs money to classrooms for students of special needs and provides those supports for them. So it is a concern. It's been on our radar for some time. We have had many meetings with government where we've asked them directly, and they've assured us that they don't plan to do that. So, but it remains a concern. And in 2019, and so what we have said to government repeatedly at the table is that this table is to restore our language that we just won back. It is not to make any changes to that language. That will happen in 2019 when we're at the collective bargaining table. And so we fully expect that they will come to the table with some provincial language and undoubtedly significant cuts. And this is another reason why we need to really look at a government that puts education as a priority. Because as we can see from the presentation, there's been a systematic underfunding of the system, and that was allowed to happen by the unconstitutional stripping of our collective agreement. So that needs to be changed, needs to be reversed, but we can never be satisfied that that won't happen again if this current government, continues with their education policies. And so that's been a concern of ours for sure. Oh, right here.
So what can we do to measure the impact of, bringing in more class, or having the classroom composition as per the collective bargaining agreement, like the smaller classroom sizes, et cetera? How are we going to measure the impact of that so that we have that information moving forward so we don't end up in this situation ever again?
So in order to assess the impact of class composition and class size, the kind of measures that we use are the number of children per classroom. We use the overall class size. We're going to be, of course, looking at the things that we've always looked at with indicators, graduation rates, et cetera. But also the BCTF conducts a number of different surveys on teacher workload, teacher working conditions, and things like that to gauge our membership's teaching experiences and to gauge your needs in the classroom. So we use a whole host of different research indicators and measures and tools to be able to gauge how these kinds of rollouts are impacting our teachers, to get that feedback, and then to, of course, make necessary adjustments in future bargaining, et cetera. So those are the kinds of tools that we have used traditionally, and we'll be exploring different types of tools, of course, in the future. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I want to see, I guess I'd like to see also the impact of children. Yeah. That's what,
Sure. No, of course, and the impacts on children we look at, of course, through different sets of socioeconomic measures and graduation measures and outcomes, et cetera. Those, of course, all feed into that type of analysis. So it's going to be a two-part analysis of teachers and children, of course, because teachers have a strong impact on children's outcomes. So their working conditions matter, and their experiences and their mental health and their emotional well-being matters, and it's going to feed on how our children do. But of course, we are going to continue to measure the same types of things with children's outcomes and expect that children's outcomes potentially will improve, right? So, and those are going to be socioeconomic as well as academic measures. Yep. Yeah.
The question is about, for those who didn't hear it, about the changes to the funding model that happened in the early years of this government towards a per student model. One of the things that I talked about and that has been floating around out there in the debate, but talked about in the paper, is there was a really interesting internal government documents at the time that the journalist Michael Smith reported on about the change in the funding model. And this was an internal memo to Cabinet, I believe, and it described how, as they were preparing, as the government was preparing to bring in these huge cuts in 2002, the memo described how under the prior funding model, they were likely to be blamed for the consequences of those cuts. They were going to have to, there's language, and I don't have it in front of me, but language in that memo about how the government would have to wear the blame for the consequences of its actions. Imagine that. And the discussion was how shifting to a funding model that squarely put the responsibility on school boards would be a way of diffusing that responsibility for cuts and laying the blame for cuts at school boards. And of course, that's exactly what they, I remember them telling us in Prince George, that of course there are no cuts, there is only a funding freeze, and anything else that happens is talk to your trustees, because it's up to them.
So this province distinguishes between homeschooling and distributed learning. So with respect to homeschooling, homeschooling has been rather flat. We haven't seen much change in the increase in homeschooling, as opposed to distributed learning, which has skyrocketed. So distributed learning, particularly in private independent schools, has gone up by over 300%. And in fact, Inclusion BC just put out a press release this week that described the increase in distributed learning among children with special needs. For reasons that we will talk about, we've talked about here a little bit today, but we'll talk about this afternoon as well. So homeschooling, traditionally homeschooling with your per student grant of about $250 per year, flat. Distributed learning, particularly among private schools, has increased exponentially. In the public school system, it has, again, remained flat. Distributed learning is flat in the public school.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Alex and Sherri, for your presentation. It was extremely informative.